Go ahead and turn off your camera, but this will record the entire meeting and it will be available for viewing afterwards. So hello everybody, welcome. I'm Michelle Foss. I am president of Green Bellevue, and I would like to welcome you to our August meeting. Today we have a panel discussion. We have several experts here who are going to talk to us about what's going on in Mead, Nebraska. So Senator Carol Blood, who represents District 3, has been busy with the things going on there and has helped us set up this panel. She is in the Nebraska legislature and is in her second term. She has legislation that lifts up all Nebraskans with emphasis on our state's most vulnerable. She's been a strong voice for many who are often voiceless and has become involved with the, oh geez, hold on, I am so sorry. I'm having some technical issues here. There we go. With Perivallon Group to help amplify their cause and find help for those affected. Also joining us today are Lisa Zaleski, author and retired award-winning investigative journalist who, during her career, specialized in coverage of agricultural issues. Members of the Perivallon Group, which is a coalition of individuals that have come together to investigate the unfolding environmental disaster in Mead, Nebraska, and seek effective, meaningful change in Nebraska's environmental laws. We are also joined by Dr. John Chalice, professor of biology at Creighton University and a professor of marine science at the University of Georgia. His teaching and research emphasizes both freshwater and marine ecosystems, biological productions, and response to both natural and human stressors. Dr. Chalice is a member of the Perivallon Group. Last but not least, we have Dr. Judy Wu-Smart, an assistant professor and extension specialist, who has been the director of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Bee Lab since the fall of 2015. At UNL, she and her team have been developing a robust pollinator health program to help beekeepers, scientists, policymakers, and land managers understand the underlying stressors challenging bee health, including pests, disease, and exposure to pesticides. Community engagement and promoting science literacy around these complicated farm-to-table issues are also key components of the Bee Lab's research and extension of the education programs. Dr. Wu-Smart is a member of the Perivallon Group. So without further ado, Senator Blood.
Well, thank you and good afternoon, friends. I am just thrilled to be here. And it's kind of fun that I get to hang out again with all the cool kids and that you get to experience it too, because I have learned so much from the experts that we have on today's Zoom call. So real briefly, because I'm just the vessel that's helping spread the message, you want to talk to the other three today, trust me. I was actually contacted at the end of session by a group of concerned citizens that you now know are called the Perivallon Group. And they asked me to carry LR 159. And what LR 159 did is it requested that the executive board for the Nebraska legislature appoint an Alten ethanol plant special investigative and oversight committee. Long name. That committee would have reported back to the legislature and specifically the appropriations committee on any necessary remediation costs, any needed changes in current statutes or policy, and any other important issues that were found to be necessary that might need to be addressed or changed. So although everybody on this call today, we know that it was a dire environmental catastrophe, and you should also know that the site was already a Superfund site, it was thought that time could not be made for this committee, to our dismay, until January or later of next year. So in response, we held a public meeting on July 8th that invited area residents to tell their stories to Nebraska media and other interested state senators who made time to come out to Mead to hear these stories. And so what today's event is that is being hosted by Green Bellevue, it's one of our many efforts to continue to educate Nebraskans and other interested parties because we don't want this discussed behind closed doors. And we don't want people to forget that this could have been prevented. And so you're going to get a lot of information today. You've already heard who's joining me, the journalist Lisa Zaleski and Dr. John Shallis and Dr. Judy Wu-Smart, and they are so knowledgeable guys. We're going to be starting from the beginning because we really want you to remember this important story. And we want you to help us prevent this type of environmental crisis from ever happening again in Nebraska, because this could have been prevented. And I'm here to say that I believe that pesticides are really just clever corporate names for poisonous chemicals, guys. These are the same chemicals that routinely kill animals and plants and organisms. And the thing that we never hear in these cases is how it also affects people's property rights, because your property rights really are being trampled upon because you receive unreasonable interference when it comes to the surrounding ecosystem and your enjoyment of your own property. So with that, I am going to remind you again that if you miss anything or there's a lot of information that you need to revisit, Green Bellevue is kind enough to have this on YouTube, so you can circle back and share it with others, and I encourage you to do so. And our first speaker today, who's going to walk through the timeline, is Lisa Zaleski, and Lisa has some great information to share with you. Lisa, I can't hear you.
Thank you, Senator Blood. I'm going to switch to share screen, so let's see if that works. How's that? Can everybody see that?
Yep.
It's good.
Okay. Great. Again, thanks, Senator Blood, for helping organize this event, and thank you so much to Green Bellevue for this opportunity. We try to take every opportunity that's offered to us to tell a story about Mead, because it is truly an environmental disaster. And we are so happy that Senator Blood stepped in. She's worked hard to elevate the public awareness and the discussion about Mead, and she's certainly helped increase transparency from state agencies. I don't think it should surprise any of us who are familiar with her that when she stepped up, things started to happen. So I'm going to use my cursor. This photo that you're looking at is a drone taken photo of the Alten site. I wasn't sure if any of you had ever been out around the site, so I wanted to familiarize you with it a little bit. These big tanks right here and over here are called Poseidon tanks. They kind of look like a big outdoor swimming pool, which is one of the things that worries me. Those are being filled with wastewater from Alten's leaking lagoons. Over here is the ethanol plant itself. And up here in this corner is the 30,000 head cattle feedlot, which is all part of this whole business model. Right here are two big hoop houses. And then what you can't see off over in here, off over in this right-hand side, are the mountains of wet cake, the stinking wet cake. So almost on any given day, the odor from the wet cake drives people in Mead and the surrounding area inside. The stench is intolerable. I don't have the words to describe it. It's smothering. It clings to your clothing and your hair, even if you're outside for just a little bit. So I want you to think about living with that on a day-to-day basis and sending your kids into a public school where they're subject to that when they're out at recess. The next two slides I'm just going to put up for a couple of seconds here. I captured some quotes over time from the people of Mead, and I wanted you to see these. Listening to their concerns and their desperation is a gut punch, let me tell you. So let's get into the details here. This is the problem. Conventional ethanol processing involves using a high starch grain like corn and mixing it with water in big heated vats where it turns into a fermenting mash. So if you just think about an alcohol still, you'll get the idea. The byproducts from this process are primarily wastewater and something called distiller's grains or wet cake. You're going to hear me talk a lot about wet cake. And the wet cake is actually just mash after it's done its job in the fermenting process. So if this is all done with harvested field corn, these byproducts that I'm talking about are valuable in agricultural use as livestock feed and can be applied as, the wet cake can be applied as a soil amendment on farm ground, and the wastewater can be suitable for irrigation. But when pesticide treated seed is used instead of field corn, the wet cake and the wastewater from the process become a vehicle for the pesticides on the seed. And that's what happened at Alten. The plant started using treated seed in 2015. I realize you can't read this, but this is an example of a seed bag label. These labels are required on every bag of treated seed under federal law. The label says, it's right in here, it says that treated seed may not be used for ethanol processing if the byproduct can't be fed to livestock, and it also prohibits its use in ethanol production if measurable residues of pesticides remain in the byproducts intended for use in agronomic practices. For years, Alten's polluted wet cake was, you guessed it, land applied as a soil amendment in various spots around Saunders County. It was hauled to a number of locations and just piled on the ground in big stinking windrows for farmers to till in. And this went on until May of 2019, when the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, which has jurisdiction over that sort of a product, ordered Alten to stop land applying the wet cake after tests showed that the neonic pesticide levels were literally off the charts. The agency also ordered Alten to retrieve the piles that were still, that remained on privately owned or leased land. And I mentioned leased land because, as an example, the city of Wahoo leases some acres to a local farmer where truckloads of the wet cake were delivered. So the city of Wahoo actually accepted loads of that. However, on his toes city worker watched a news report out of Omaha, and then they went about and had it removed, but the damage was already done. But after all of that, Alten was allowed to continue processing treated seed. And so those mountains of wet cake on the site, on the plant site, just grew exponentially because now they had nowhere to go with it. It's also notable that Alten's wastewater was used for crop irrigation purposes for years also. So a little bit about treated seed and excess seed. Treated seed is routinely used in farm operations across North America. In fact, it's estimated that about 100% of US corn acres are planted with treated seed and about 75% of soybeans as well. And there's a lot of other crop seeds that are also treated. That's wheat, sorghum, even popcorn seed is treated. The seed is treated with systemic insecticides and fungicides, commonly referred to as neonicotinoids, or we call them neonics. I do anyway, because it's easier for me to pronounce. So following me, Dr. Wu-Smart and Dr. Shallis will get into more detail about the chemicals and the compounds involved. But I'll share this. Systemic means the pesticides are taken up by the plant, enter the plant's circulatory system, and become embedded in plant tissue. The neonics are designed to kill insects that damage crops. largely chewing or sucking insects, but the pesticides can also be expressed by the plant through flowering and pollen, which in turn can affect other beneficial insects, including bees and birds. And science is just now discovering that pesticides are affecting wildlife like deer and their offspring. Anecdotally, we've heard reports of sick or dead raccoons, beavers, and domestic pets in the Mead area, particularly around the piles of wet cake. So some of you might wonder why there's excess treated seed every year. That's because climate and market conditions dramatically affect a farmer's decision about what crop to plant. And so it's difficult for the manufacturers to predict the demand for any given seed in any given year. And treated seed has a limited shelf life. Thus, the seed manufacturers end up with millions of tons of excess seed to get rid of. And so what happens to the excess seed left over? It's a gray area. The seed manufacturers advise that it should be disposed of in a licensed solid waste facility, or that it should be grown out by planting it on fallow or unused land. But make no mistake about this. For those seed manufacturers to divest themselves of excess seed at a solid waste facility permitted to handle that kind of a hazmat is expensive. So after 6+ years of processing treated seed into ethanol, the Alten plant site in Mead now contains about 84,000 tons of polluted wet cake in these mountainous piles, which they, by the way, are now starting to consolidate. And anytime you move that wet cake, it unleashes a stink like none other. Also on site are 175 million gallons of equally polluted wastewater. That's what they're moving around to those Poseidon tanks. And hopefully that water is being treated and filtered before it's put in the Poseidon tanks, but I have not been able to confirm that. And those lagoons have had damaged liners virtually since day one when the plant opened. So we know that the toll that has already been taken. We have sick humans, we have collapse of bee colonies, and recently the loss of a private 6-acre pond 6 miles downstream from the plant. And I'll get into that in a second here, as well as reports of sick or dead wildlife in the vicinity. And that's to say nothing about the loss of quality of life for the people who live in that area. So you have to just put yourself in their shoes and think about living with that stink. They can't open their windows on most days. It's awful. They can't hang laundry out. Nobody goes for walks or bicycle rides. So there are a lot of unknowns at this point, and Dr. Shallis and Dr. Wu-Smart will point out to you exactly what we don't know. There just isn't a lot of science about a lot of this. But what we do know is that it could take, at this point, it could take years for the problems to manifest themselves. And it's those unknowns that make me lose sleep. I think a lot about that young couple with the 2 and the 4-year-old, and they don't know if their kids are going to live a long life or if they're going to have pediatric cancer. So what's at stake here? Obviously quite a bit. Human health, drinking water, wildlife, domestic pets, the honey industry, pollinators, fish, frogs, and vertebrates, and maybe more. But in addition, also at stake is the Clear Creek Platte River Basin, where Lincoln's well field is located. So how did all of this happen? In the early 2000s, a man named Dennis Langley from Kansas, who's a politically connected one-time owner of the Kansas pipeline, chose Mead, Nebraska as the site for his E3 biofuels ethanol plant. In the early days, it was known as E3. Today, it's Alten. Langley originally purchased more than 2,000 acres of land in the area, as well as an adjacent 28,000 head feedlot. And he came to the village of Mead and Saunders County officials and the media too, promising jobs, economic growth, and a market for locally grown corn. I'm sure you guys have heard that a lot. So he said he was going to put Mead in the state of Nebraska on the map with a technology that was not yet used in ethanol manufacturing. And he also promised repeatedly no net loss to the environment. So this shows Langley's original business model that was presented to the village of Mead when he sought from them and received tax increment district funding. And that included an annexation of 250 acres of his property. Also, he needed from them various permits for construction and conditional use. The same model was used with Saunders County supervisors when he approached them for certain permits as well. So the closed loop system, according to Langley, it was going to be new cutting edge process. It was going to put Nebraska on the map. So the closed loop system essentially is the manure from the feedlot would be collected and then piped underground to these biodigesters where the methane was made. And that methane would fuel the boilers where the mash is made, and the byproduct, that wet cake, would be fed to the feedlot cattle or applied to cropland as a soil amendment. So ground was broken on the E3 plant in 2005. In June of 2007, Langley hosted a ceremony at the plant site celebrating his new approach to ethanol production. And there were plenty of politicians. Governor Heineman showed up. There were state agency officials, people from NRD. 5 months later, E3 filed bankruptcy. They filed for bankruptcy protection, and they did so in Kansas bankruptcy court. The bankruptcy documents say that a boiler at the plant exploded when it was ignited the first time, and the plant could not sustain ethanol production in time to meet its debt. In the bankruptcy process, 16 local companies were caught in the court's look back, and some of those went bankrupt themselves after the court told them they had to cough up the money that they had been paid. There's a grain company in Ashland that had been paid shortly before bankruptcy was filed. And I believe that involved about $100,000, and the grain company went under because of that. So when I researched the background of E3 biofuels, and I can tell you, I'm not done yet, and I started in February. It reflects, E3 and Langley reflect a layer upon layer of LLCs. It looks like a complicated spider web in the bankruptcy documents. And I know you can't read the slide, and that's not important that you do. I just want you to see this, because that's the spider web of LLCs that were involved with the ethanol plant in Mead. And I'm trying to find a nice way to say this. I can find no evidence in Saunders County or the village of Mead minutes or other documents that any official, any decision maker ever really understood who or what they were doing business with when they issued all those conditional use and other permits. And I can find no record of anybody asking any questions. But when it was all said and done, this is what they were involved with. So in 2010, the plant emerged from bankruptcy under a new name, Alten Ethanol. Nothing much had really changed. It just reorganized. Langley was still in charge, and he just had new money, new investors. By 2014, Alten wanted to construct 2 1 million bushel grain storage warehouses. And that's those big white hoop houses I showed you on the original picture. and the Mead trustees issued their approval. These big buildings were used to store pallets of bags of treated seed to get them out of the weather. And they were hauled then from the hoop houses over to the ethanol processing area and then made into mash. So in October of that year, Tanner Shaw, who was Dennis Langley's stepson, informed the Village of Mead trustees that the plant would be reopening soon and would be processing corn and milo. There's no mention in those minutes of treated seed. So almost immediately after the plant finally went back into production in 2015, citizen complaints began about the stench emanating from the plant. And there was a sudden onset of health problems, complaints, bloody noses, sore throats, respiratory problems, infected eyes, and the like. For anybody that had any underlying lung conditions, it was miserable. By the third quarter of 2015, the Village of Mead and NDEE were regularly receiving, both entities were regularly receiving citizen complaints. And village trustees requested a public hearing with NDEE regarding Alten's requested permit modifications. At the same time, trustees were concerned about Alten's delinquent water and sewer account. Somebody should have read the tea leaves. So when did NDEE know the plant was using treated seed? The agency admits it, that it knew as early as mid-2015. But on the NDEE website, there's a 2012 letter from Alten to NDEE that signaled that the plant was considering the use of treated seed. That was the only time it was ever mentioned. And it was only mentioned as a consideration. So in 2017, Dennis Langley died, and then his stepson, Tanner Shaw, became in charge at Alten. But by this time, former Saunders County Attorney Scott Tinglehoff, who had been defeated in his reelection bid, was now the general manager at Alten. 2019, when testing was finally conducted that screened for neonics in 2019 and found very high neonic content, then in May of that year, 2019, the Nebraska Department of Agriculture ordered the land application halted. One of the pesticides was found at 85 times the EPA limit, and the plant's liquid waste neonic content was measured at 300 times that allowed in drinking water. The Department of Ag's order, however, essentially made the wet cake on the Alten site a solid waste. And Alten is not a licensed solid waste disposal facility. And that fight has endured. It's still going on. But nonetheless, Alten was allowed to continue using the treated seed. In August 2020, and this is a Defiant Alten, they thumb their nose at NDEE all the time. And so despite all of this controversy going on, and they already knew the neonic levels in the wet cake. In August 2020, they sent out an email across the bandwidth of treated seed manufacturers in North America, soliciting their discard or excess seed at zero cost to the manufacturers. And the company claimed in the email, the byproducts could all be land applied under permits issued by the state of Nebraska and allowance by USDA and EPA. These are excerpts from that particular email. And you'll note that they reveal the companies that they were under contract with. Now think about this, these seed manufacturers can ship their treated seed. They don't have to pay anything. Alten takes it at zero cost. It's cheap, free actually. So we know that they were doing business with Monsanto, Bayer, Syngenta, Dow AgReliant, Land Lakes, and at least 100 others, according to that email. Despite all of the violations and Alten's defiance of those, despite being delinquent in property taxes to the tune of $500,000, in late 2020, the state saw fit to award $210,000 to Alten in COVID-19 relief funds. in January of 2021, this is key. The Guardian published an article by investigative reporter Carrie Gilman titled "There's a Red Flag Here," which told the story about Alten and the devastating collapse of bee colonies for which Dr. Wu-Smart was interviewed. This unlocked a lot of public pressure that needed to be put on NDEE, and it brought forth a lot of public scrutiny, not nearly enough, but it was the gateway to getting the subject out in the public. So on February 4th, 2021, NDEE ordered Alten to immediately halt the discharge of wastewater into its nearly overflowing lagoons. NDEE Director Jim Macy wrote that the wastewater alone was an imminent and substantial risk for release. And sure enough, on February 12th, 2021, disaster struck when a pipe ruptured on one of those two biodigesters at the plant, and it emitting 4 million gallons of pesticide polluted wastewater and manure stillage that made its way into a stream bed and traveled downstream into the Platte River Basin.